The will wasn't read in a courtroom or a quiet office with leather chairs and solemn nods. It was read at my kitchen table, the same one where I'd folded his shirts for 31 years, where I'd paid the bills, planned birthdays, and learned to swallow disappointment with a smile. My name is Margaret Hale. I am 61 years old, and I live in Burlington, Vermont, in a white house with blue shutters that everyone in this neighborhood associates with us, not me. That distinction mattered more than anyone realized. The morning the envelope arrived, thick and official, I knew before I opened it that something was wrong. Not because I expected betrayal. No, betrayal only surprises people who haven't learned how quietly it rehearses. But because my husband, Daniel, had always been meticulous about appearances. Even in death, he wouldn't have wanted chaos. The letter was too clean, too confident, too certain of its outcome. I made tea before opening it. I always do when something important is about to happen. Habit is a kind of armor when you're about to be told your life has been reassigned. The words inside were precise and devastating. Margaret Hale is not named as a beneficiary. No anger in the language, no explanation, just a conclusion delivered as fact. The house, the accounts, the investments I'd helped build, everything had been allocated elsewhere. A woman whose name I recognized immediately, not because I suspected her, but because she'd sat at my table, laughed at my jokes, and called me strong when it suited her. In that moment, I didn't cry. I didn't even feel shocked. I felt cataloged, reduced to a footnote in a story I had financed, organized, and endured. And before we go any further, let me ask you this. Have you ever discovered that your loyalty was counted on not because it was valued, but because it was convenient? If you're listening to this from somewhere in the world where quiet women are expected to accept loud decisions, stay with me. Because what happened next wasn't about rage or revenge in the way people imagine it. It was about precision, about dignity, about letting everyone who underestimated me learn the cost of writing me out before the ink was dry. What hurt most in the hours that followed wasn't the loss itself, but the way my entire marriage began to rearrange itself in my memory, like furniture moved while you were out of the room. I sat there with the letter in my hands, rereading the same lines again and again, not because I didn't understand them, but because I was searching for some familiar trace of the man I thought I'd known. Daniel had always presented himself as fair, even gentle in his logic. He used words like responsible, reasonable, planned. He believed chaos was a moral failure. That belief was something I'd trusted for decades. And yet here it was, proof that while I'd been tending to the visible parts of our life, our home, our family obligations, his illnesses, his silences, there had been an entire second narrative unfolding beyond my line of sight. I began replaying the last 5 years with a sharper lens. His sudden interest in streamlining finances. The way he insisted on handling estate planning alone because it was too stressful for me. How he dismissed my questions with a tired smile, telling me I deserved peace now, not paperwork. Peace, I realized, had been code for exclusion. I remembered the dinners where he'd seemed distracted, his phone always face down, his mind somewhere I couldn't follow. I remembered the woman named in the will, Clara, how she'd entered our lives slowly, first as a colleague, then a confidant, then a presence Daniel insisted was harmless. "She understands my work," he'd said once, as if understanding him required access to everything else. At the time, I'd taken pride in being the wife who didn't question loyalty, who trusted stability over suspicion. Sitting there now, I understood how neatly that trust had been used against me. This wasn't a mistake made in grief or confusion. This was a long, deliberate arrangement, crafted with the confidence that I would accept it quietly, perhaps even gracefully. The idea stung more than any financial loss ever could, because money can be replaced. Time cannot. And 31 years of shared life had just been reduced to an administrative oversight, a name omitted with surgical precision. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, my hands steady despite the storm inside me. I wasn't ready to react, not yet. But somewhere beneath the betrayal, beneath the ache of being erased, something else began to form. A question, calm and persistent, who benefits from my silence now? And once that question took hold, I knew this story was far from finished. By the third day, the condolences began to feel rehearsed, like lines delivered from a script everyone else had read except me. Friends called to ask how I was holding up, their voices gentle, careful not to disturb whatever version of grief they assumed I should be inhabiting. I thanked them, told them I was managing, because managing had always been my specialty. What I didn't say, what I couldn't yet articulate, was that grief wasn't the dominant feeling tightening my chest. It was recognition. The slow, uncomfortable recognition that my role in Daniel's life had been redefined long before his death, and I had been the last to know. I walked through the house that afternoon with a notebook in my hand, something I hadn't done since the early years of our marriage when we were still counting pennies and dreaming out loud. Every room held evidence of my presence. The curtains I'd chosen, the shelves I'd installed, the systems I'd put in place to keep our life running smoothly. Yet legally, according to the document sitting in my kitchen drawer, none of it was mine anymore. That contradiction unsettled me more than any outright cruelty could have. I stopped in Daniel's study, a room he'd always described as off-limits when he needed to think. I used to respect that boundary without question, believing privacy and secrecy were the same thing. Now, standing there alone, I realized how much space I'd ceded without ever being asked. I opened drawers, not out of spite, but out of necessity, and found exactly what I'd expected. Folders labeled with dates, investment summaries, correspondence with advisors I'd never met. There was no chaos here, no emotional impulsiveness. Everything had been planned with care, including my absence. That was the moment my sadness hardened into something more durable. Not anger, anger burns too quickly, but resolve. I sat at his desk and began reading, not like a widow looking for answers, but like a woman auditing a system that had quietly decided she was expendable. And as I read, one truth became impossible to ignore. Daniel hadn't just prepared for his own death. He had prepared for my silence. What I uncovered in that study didn't shock me so much as it confirmed a suspicion I hadn't allowed myself to name before. There were emails printed and filed, not hidden, just organized in a way that assumed no one else would ever look. Conversations with estate planners, financial advisors, and a private attorney whose name I recognized only because Daniel once mentioned him in passing as very discreet. Discreet. Another word that sounded respectable until you examined who it served. I sat there for hours, reading slowly, carefully, letting the full shape of the betrayal take form without rushing to conclusions. Daniel hadn't acted out of passion or panic. He had acted out of confidence. Confidence that I would grieve quietly. Confidence that I would be too overwhelmed, too polite, too conditioned to keep the peace to question the outcome. Confidence that I would accept being portrayed as the surviving spouse who was provided for in other ways, even as the core of our shared life was transferred to someone else. Clara's name appeared more often than I expected, not as a sudden addition, but as a steady presence woven into long-term plans. Trusts discussed, assets reallocated, safeguards installed, and all of it framed not as deception, but as prudence, as if excluding me was an act of responsibility rather than betrayal. I leaned back in Daniel's chair, the leather still bearing the faint impression of his posture, and felt something inside me settle. This wasn't a moment for confrontation or tears. This was a moment for understanding leverage. I had spent decades managing complexity, family schedules, crises, finances, people's emotions, without ever labeling it as power. But power doesn't always announce itself with titles or signatures. Sometimes it lives in familiarity, in knowing where systems bend, where assumptions lie, where people cut corners because they believe no one will ever challenge them. Daniel had built his plan on the assumption that I wouldn't look too closely, wouldn't ask the uncomfortable questions, wouldn't step outside the role assigned to me. Sitting there, surrounded by the evidence of his certainty, I realized something quietly transformative. His greatest safeguard had been my predictability. And predictability, once broken, leaves very little standing. That evening, I didn't call a lawyer, and I didn't confront Clara, even though her number was saved in Daniel's phone under a name that suggested professional distance rather than intimacy. I did something far less dramatic and far more consequential. I made a list. Not of grievances, not of suspicions, but of facts. Dates, asset names, advisors, filing locations, trust titles. I wrote the way I used to when Daniel traveled and left everything to me, methodically, without emotion, knowing that order itself is a form of control. As I wrote, another truth became impossible to ignore. Despite how carefully Daniel had structured his exit, he had relied heavily on one assumption, that I was merely a spouse, not a participant. That assumption had allowed him to overlook something critical. I knew the systems because I had kept them running. I knew the gaps because I had filled them for years. I knew which accounts were old, which ones had been rolled over, which documents predated certain regulations, and which decisions had been made when laws were different than they were now. That kind of institutional memory doesn't disappear just because someone tries to write you out. Late that night, I opened a locked drawer I hadn't touched in years and pulled out a thin binder labeled contingencies. It was something Daniel and I had assembled decades earlier after a close friend lost everything in a sudden legal dispute. Back then, we'd promised each other transparency, redundancy, protection. Somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten that promise, but I hadn't. Inside the binder were copies of older agreements, handwritten notes, and one document that made my breath catch. A prenuptial addendum Daniel himself had insisted on revisiting years ago, never officially dissolved, only amended in ways that depended on conditions he could no longer fulfill. I sat very still as the implications settled in. This wasn't about contesting a will out of spite. This was about recognizing that Daniel's final plan, for all its polish, wasn't as airtight as he believed. He had planned for my grief. He had planned for my compliance. What he hadn't planned for was my memory or my patience. The next morning, I woke with a steadiness that surprised me, not because the pain had lessened, it hadn't, but because it had finally found direction. Grief without direction is paralyzing. Grief with purpose becomes something else entirely. I showered, dressed carefully, and made myself presentable not for anyone else, but because I needed to see myself as someone who still occupied the world with intention. Then I began making calls, quiet ones, strategic ones. I didn't announce myself as a widow seeking justice. I introduced myself as a stakeholder seeking clarification. That distinction mattered. The first advisor I contacted hesitated when I mentioned Daniel's name, his tone shifting subtly when I referenced specific documents and dates. Knowledge has a way of changing how people speak to you. The second call went even further. An estate administrator who had assumed all communications would flow through Clara sounded genuinely unsettled when I asked why I hadn't been notified of certain filings. "I was told you were aware," he said carefully. That was the first crack. By the afternoon, I understood that Daniel's plan depended not just on legality, but on momentum. Everyone involved had moved forward under the assumption that I wouldn't interrupt the process, wouldn't slow it down with questions, wouldn't force them to revisit decisions already set in motion. I was meant to be background noise, not a variable. But systems hate variables. They require resolution. And the moment I began asking for documentation instead of reassurance, for explanations instead of sympathy, the machinery around his estate began to hesitate. Files were rechecked. Dates were cross-referenced. Clauses were reread. No one accused Daniel of wrongdoing, not yet. But uncertainty crept in, and uncertainty is poison to plans built on confidence. I could feel the shift happening beyond my sight, like pressure building in a sealed room. That evening, as I sat at the same kitchen table where the will had first been read, I realized something that settled deep in my bones. I didn't need to expose Daniel. I didn't need to humiliate Clara. I didn't need revenge in the way people imagine it. All I needed was to keep asking questions. Because the truth, when forced into the open, has a way of dismantling even the most carefully arranged betrayals, especially when the person asking has finally stopped trying to be agreeable. By the end of that week, the atmosphere around Daniel's estate had changed in ways that no announcement could have captured. It wasn't chaos, far from it. It was hesitation. Meetings were postponed, pending review. Emails that once arrived with confident conclusions now ended with cautious language and requests for confirmation. Clara stopped calling. That silence told me more than any confrontation ever could. People who are certain of their position don't retreat, they press forward. Her absence was proof that my questions had reached exactly where they needed to. I spent my days reviewing documents, not obsessively, but deliberately, allowing the full architecture of Daniel's plan to reveal itself. And in doing so, I saw the flaw he hadn't anticipated. His revisions to the will were legally sound on their surface, but they relied on the assumption that prior agreements were irrelevant, outdated, or forgotten. They weren't. One trust amendment referenced a condition that was never fulfilled. Another transfer assumed my consent had been implied by marriage, ignoring statutory protections for long-term spouses in this state, protections Daniel himself had once insisted we learn together. I began to understand the irony of it all. The man who prided himself on foresight had underestimated the one person who knew his thinking best. Not because I was smarter or crueler, but because I had always been paying attention. Each night, I wrote notes in the margins of copies, connecting dots, highlighting inconsistencies, not with urgency, but with patience. Patience had always been my strength. I had simply stopped giving it away for free. Somewhere along the line, this stopped feeling like a response to betrayal and started feeling like reclamation. I wasn't dismantling Daniel's legacy, I was correcting it. Restoring balance to a narrative that had quietly tried to exclude the woman who had helped build it. And as the pressure continued to mount around his carefully arranged final act, I knew this much with absolute certainty. The ending he had planned was no longer under his control. The formal challenge didn't come from me. It came from the system itself, exactly as I'd expected once the right questions were asked in the right order. A notice arrived requesting clarification on conflicting filings, then another asking for documentation that had supposedly already been submitted. Each request slowed the process, and in legal matters, delay is not passive, it is corrosive. Clara finally reached out, her message carefully worded, almost polite, as if civility could still disguise what was unraveling beneath it. She suggested a conversation, framed it as a chance to honor Daniel's wishes together. I declined, not because I was afraid of what she might say, but because dialogue was no longer necessary. The record spoke clearly now, louder than any appeal to sentiment ever could. The advisors, once aligned and efficient, began protecting themselves, requesting written confirmations, distancing their recommendations from final decisions. That shift told me everything. People don't retreat unless they sense exposure. One afternoon, an estate attorney I'd never contacted directly called to ask about the prenuptial addendum I'd referenced earlier. He sounded unsettled, not hostile, and that mattered. When I explained that the addendum had never been lawfully dissolved, and that its conditions directly contradicted the revised will, there was a long silence on the line. He thanked me for the clarification. That night, I slept deeply for the first time since Daniel's death, not because the pain was gone, but because the truth was finally doing its work without my intervention. I understood then that real power doesn't argue, it waits. And the structure Daniel had built to exclude me was beginning to collapse under the weight of its own assumptions. The decision came quietly, without ceremony, the way outcomes often do when they are unavoidable. I was notified not by a dramatic phone call or a tense meeting, but by a formal letter stating that the revised will would be held in abeyance pending further legal reconciliation with prior agreements. In simpler terms, Daniel's final arrangement was no longer enforceable as written. The assets were frozen, redistributed into review, and most critically, my status as surviving spouse with standing was fully reinstated. I read the letter twice, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to feel its weight settle properly. Somewhere in an office far from my kitchen table, a group of professionals had reached the same conclusion I had weeks earlier. The story Daniel left behind did not add up. Clara never contacted me again after that. I heard through indirect channels that she was disappointed, that she felt blindsided, that she believed Daniel's intentions were being misinterpreted. I didn't respond to any of it. Intentions are irrelevant once actions are documented. What mattered was not what Daniel meant to do, but what he actually did, and what he failed to account for. I walked through my home that evening with a new awareness, not of ownership, but of presence. This place was no longer a backdrop to someone else's decisions. It was mine again, not because a document said so, but because I had refused to disappear quietly. The sense of closure that settled over me wasn't triumphant, it was clarifying. I hadn't won something that was taken. I had simply prevented a lie from becoming permanent, and that distinction mattered more than anyone else could understand. I didn't celebrate when it was over. There was no moment of raised glasses or triumphant phone calls, no urge to tell anyone how close I'd come to being erased. Instead, there was a quiet morning not long after, when I sat alone at the kitchen table, sunlight stretching across the same wood where my life had nearly been signed away, and felt something settle inside me at last. Peace, not the fragile kind that depends on other people behaving well, but the durable kind that comes from knowing you will not abandon yourself again. Daniels will no longer define me, and neither did his betrayal. What defined me was the choice I made when I realized I was expected to disappear politely. I stayed. I paid attention. I asked questions. And I let the truth do what it always does when given time and space. It corrected the story. If you've ever been written out of something you helped build, if you've ever been underestimated because you were quiet, loyal, or patient, I want you to know you're not alone. Tell me in the comments if you've lived through something similar, and let me know where you're listening from. I read every message. If you want more real, powerful stories like this, subscribe to the channel. And always remember this, no matter who tries to decide your worth for you, don't underestimate the power of women. And Merry Christmas.